My roommate snuck her boyfriend into our dorm every night. I stayed silent until my stuff started breaking. I never thought I would be the kind of girl people whispered about in the hallway, the one they called dramatic, or petty, or heartless, because I have always been the quiet roommate, the one who cleans shared spaces and labels her food and keeps her headphones in, even when the room feels too small for two people. Living in a dorm teaches you compromise quickly. You learn how to share airspace, silence, and privacy. And when I moved in with her, I thought we had an unspoken understanding that we would respect each other even when it was inconvenient. At first, everything was fine. We had different schedules, different friend groups, different personalities, but nothing that felt unmanageable until I started noticing small things that didn't belong to either of us, shoes by the door that weren't mine, whispers when I came back, late cologne lingering in a room meant for two girls. When I asked her casually, she laughed it off, told me I was imagining things, told me I was stressed and needed sleep, and I wanted to believe her because believing her meant avoiding conflict, and I'm very good at avoiding conflict. But the signs kept stacking quietly, like evidence I didn't want to collect. He came after curfew, always after the halls went quiet, always careful, always hidden. Like this was some secret we were all supposed to protect. I reminded her once about the dorm rules, tried to keep my tone light, and she rolled her eyes, told me everyone does it, told me to relax, and that was the first time I felt like my comfort mattered less than her convenience. Still, I stayed quiet because I told myself it wasn't my business, because reporting her felt extreme, and because deep down, I didn't want to be the reason someone else got in trouble. Then my things started changing, my shampoo bottle emptier than it should be, my towel damp when I hadn't showered, my space no longer feeling like mine, and when I mentioned it, she laughed again, said it was no big deal, said I was overreacting. I swallowed it like I swallowed everything else until the morning. I woke up early for an exam, already anxious, already tired, and reached for my hairdryer, only to watch it spark, then die in my hand. I stood there holding it, knowing without asking exactly who had used it night before. And in that moment, something shifted inside me because it wasn't about the rule anymore. It was about respect. That was the moment I realized staying silent wasn't keeping the peace. It was teaching her she could keep taking from me. When does patience turn into self-betrayal? When I confronted her about the hairdryer, she didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted something more important than my frustration. And that reaction hurt more than the broken cord ever could. She admitted he used it, said he probably dropped it, said she would talk to him, but never said sorry, never offered to replace it, never acknowledged that it was mine and that I depended on it. And that small dismissal told me exactly where I stood in her priorities. I tried explaining calmly that I wasn't comfortable with him being there every night, that we could both get written up, that I didn't sign up to share my space with someone I didn't know, and she brushed it off again. Told me I was being dramatic, told me to stop acting like his presence was ruining my life, but it was ruining something important. My sense of safety in my own room, my ability to relax, my feeling that this was my space too, and not just somewhere I existed quietly while she lived loudly. That night, I lay awake listening to them, whisper, laugh, move around the room, like I wasn't there, and I realized how invisible I had become in a space I paid for, and that realization hurt, in a way I couldn't explain to anyone else. The next morning, I stood outside the RA's door longer than I want to admit, my hands shaking, my heart racing. Because reporting someone feels like crossing a line you can never uncross. I didn't exaggerate, I didn't lie, I just stated facts that a guest was being brought in past curfew consistently and that it was affecting me. And even as I spoke, I felt guilty, like I was betraying some unspoken roommate code. The RA thanked me, said they would handle it discreetly, and that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. When she got called in, she came back furious, eyes sharp, voice cold, accusing me of outing her relationship, of embarrassing her, of ruining something important in her life. And suddenly I was the villain in a story I never wanted to be part of. She told our friends her version, leaving out the rules. The broken hairdryer, the nights I lay awake uncomfortable, and now people look at me differently, like I chose cruelty over kindness. Sometimes I wonder if they're right, but then I remember that boundaries aren't cruelty and silence isn't kindness when it only protects one person. Should roommates protect each other even when uncomfortable? After the RA talk, the room felt colder, not physically but emotionally, like the air itself had shifted. And suddenly everything we did felt loaded with meaning. Every drawer slammed, every silence stretched longer than it needed to. She stopped speaking to me except when necessary, her movements sharp, intentional, like she wanted me to feel her anger, and maybe she did because guilt has a way of creeping in late at night when the lights are off and you're left alone with your thoughts. I replayed everything, wondering if I should have tried harder to talk to her first, wondering if I escalated too quickly, wondering if I let frustration guide a decision that permanently damaged something that could have been resolved quietly. But every time I started doubting myself, I remembered how small I felt before I spoke up, how much space I had given her, how little I was allowed in return. People talk about dorm life like it's just a phase, but when your room becomes a place of tension, it affects everything: your sleep, your focus, your mood. And my grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate in a place where I didn't feel welcome. She started staying out more, probably with him, probably to avoid me, and the irony wasn't lost on me that her freedom came from me, retreating further into myself. Friends stopped visiting our room, the atmosphere too heavy, too awkward, and I felt isolated in a way that made me question whether standing up for myself was worth the social cost. Then one night, I overheard her crying on the phone, saying she couldn't believe I would do this to her, saying she trusted me, and hearing that hurt, because trust should go both ways, and mine had been quietly ignored. I wanted to apologize, not for reporting, but for the hurt I caused, and when I tried, she shut me down, told me she didn't want to hear it, told me I made my choice. That was when I understood something important, that sometimes people don't want resolution. They want compliance, and when you refuse, they label you the problem. I stopped trying after that, not out of anger but exhaustion, because carrying someone else's resentment is heavy and I had carried enough as peace, worth sacrificing comfort. Living together after that felt like sharing a room with a storm you couldn't see coming because nothing was openly hostile yet. Everything felt sharp and deliberate, like every small movement carried intention, and every silence felt louder than words. She rearranged her side of the room, moved things just enough to remind me that she could control the space if she wanted to, and I responded by shrinking further into myself, keeping my belongings close, keeping my routines quiet, keeping my presence small like that might soften her anger. I started spending more time in the library, not because I loved studying there, but because it was neutral territory, a place where no one glared at me for existing. And I told myself this was temporary, that dorm conflicts always pass. But deep down, I knew something fundamental had changed. What hurt most wasn't her anger, but how easily she rewrote the story. When friends visited, she laughed loudly, told them how strict the dorm was, how people overreacted about rules, how some roommates just couldn't mind their own business, and I would sit there pretending not to hear, feeling my chest tighten as the narrative slipped out of my control. No one asked for my side, and I didn't offer it because defending yourself too loudly can make you look guilty, and I was tired of explaining why my comfort mattered as much as hers. At night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the building, wondering when shared living became shared suffering, and whether standing up for myself always had to feel this lonely. The RA followed up once, asked if things had improved, and I nodded, because technically the boyfriend wasn't there anymore, at least not overnight, and technically the rules were being followed, but emotional fallout doesn't show up on incident reports. I noticed small changes in myself, how I flinched at sudden noises, how I checked my belongings obsessively, how I avoided confrontation even more than before, and I hated that a situation meant to protect me had also changed me in ways I didn't ask for. One afternoon, she finally spoke to me, properly asked why I couldn't just talk to her first, and the question stunned me because I had tried, I had hinted, reminded, suggested, and been dismissed every time, and I realized she didn't remember those conversations the way I did because they never mattered to her. I told her quietly that I did talk, that I felt ignored, and she shrugged, said she didn't think it was serious, and that response made something click inside me because it explained everything. To her, my discomfort was invisible until it inconvenienced her, and once I saw that clearly, the guilt began to loosen its grip. That night, I wrote a list, not of her wrongs, but of my boundaries, what I needed to feel safe, what I deserved in shared spaces, and reading it back reminded me that asking for respect is not betrayal, and enforcing rules is not cruelty. I stopped apologizing after. That stopped shrinking, stopped pretending I was wrong for wanting peace in my own room, and even though the tension remained, something inside me finally steadied. Because sometimes growth doesn't look like resolution. It looks like choosing yourself, even when the room stays uncomfortable. Have you ever been blamed for enforcing boundaries? Once I stopped apologizing, the dynamic shifted again, not because the tension disappeared, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. And that subtle change gave me a strange sense of balance, like standing still in strong wind instead of leaning until you fall. She noticed too. I think because her anger softened into distance, less slamming, less commentary, more silence. And while silence had once scared me now, it felt like space. I could finally breathe in. I focused on small routines, grounding one's morning walks to class, coffee at the same corner table, studying with headphones on, choosing predictability where I could, because unpredictability had exhausted me. Friends slowly returned, asking cautious questions, glancing between us like they were stepping into a fragile zone. And when they asked what happened, I answered simply that boundaries were crossed and rules were broken, and I needed to feel safe, and most of them nodded. Like that made sense, even if they didn't want to admit it publicly. There were still moments that stung, overhearing jokes about strict roommates, passive comments about people who take things too seriously, and I learned something important then. That not every opinion deserves correction, and not every misunderstanding needs your energy. One evening, she came back late, sat on her bed, and for the first time in weeks spoke without accusation. She said she felt embarrassed. She said she felt exposed. And hearing that reminded me that conflict rarely has a single villain. It just has two people protecting different versions of themselves. I listened without interrupting, without defending myself. And when she finished, I told her calmly that I never wanted to embarrass her, that I just wanted honesty and respect. And while she didn't apologize, she didn't argue either. And that felt like progress. Living together didn't suddenly become easy, but it became manageable, and sometimes manageable is enough when the alternative is constant self-doubt. I replaced my hairdryer with money I shouldn't have spent and labeled it not out of pettiness but clarity, and no one touched it again. As the semester continued, I noticed how much stronger I felt in situations outside the room, speaking up in group projects, setting limits with friends, saying no without over-explaining, and I realized that standing my ground here had given me practice I didn't know I needed. I stopped questioning whether reporting her made me a bad person, because bad people don't lose sleep over fairness, and bad people don't wonder if they caused harm. What I did wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and honesty is rarely neat. The dorm remained the same. Building, same rules, same curfews, but I changed inside it. And when I thought about next year, about different housing, different roommates, I felt something close to relief instead of fear. Because now I knew I could handle discomfort without disappearing into it. Sometimes, late at night, I still wondered if things could have gone differently, if one conversation had landed better, if one apology had come sooner. But wondering doesn't rewrite reality. It just delays acceptance. And acceptance finally arrived quietly when I realized that protecting your peace will always upset people who benefited from your silence. Is honesty worth the discomfort it creates? As winter settled in and the semester edged closer to its end, the tension in the room became less sharp but more constant, like a low hum You stop noticing until it suddenly goes quiet. And I realized how much energy I had spent adapting to discomfort without ever questioning why it was required of me. We lived side by side now, more like polite strangers than roommates, sharing space without sharing warmth, exchanging neutral updates about schedules, lights off times exam weeks, conversations stripped of emotion to avoid friction. And while that distance protected me, it also made the room feel temporary, like I was already halfway gone. I noticed how carefully I planned my time, choosing hours. She was likely out choosing silence over music, choosing invisibility over conflict. And it dawned on me that even though I had reclaimed my boundaries, I was still shaping my life around the aftermath of someone else's choices. That realization unsettled me because growth shouldn't require shrinking and healing shouldn't feel like constant vigilance. And I started asking myself whether staying quiet was still a choice or just another version of avoidance. Around that time, someone on my floor got written up for something minor, and the rumor mill exploded. And listening to people complain about unfair enforcement made me realize how often rules are only criticized when they inconvenience us, not when they protect us. I thought about how easily the situation could have escalated, how both of us could have faced consequences, and how invisible my risk had been in her narrative. And that understanding gave me clarity, not anger. Clarity that what I did wasn't impulsive, it was preventative. One night while organizing my desk, I found the broken hairdryer cord tucked into a drawer, and holding it felt strangely grounding, like physical proof that my memory wasn't exaggerated, that the frustration was real, that I hadn't imagined being crossed. I threw it away, then not out of bitterness but closure, because holding on to broken things doesn't make them useful again. She started bringing friends over more often, laughter filling the room, and for the first time I didn't feel displaced by it, because laughter without secrecy feels different. It doesn't steal space, it shares it. We weren't friends again, but we weren't enemies either, and that middle ground taught me something valuable, that not every conflict needs reconciliation to be resolved. Sometimes, coexistence with boundaries is the healthiest outcome. I began preparing for move out packing, slowly labeling boxes, deciding what parts of this year I wanted to carry forward and what I was ready to leave behind, and the answer surprised me because I wasn't packing resentment or guilt, I was packing self-trust. Looking back, I could finally see the situation clearly, not through anger or shame, but perspective. And perspective made everything quieter inside me. I understood now that choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop caring about others, it means you stop disappearing to make them comfortable. And that lesson was worth every uncomfortable night in that room. When does coexistence become healthier than reconciliation? Move out week arrived quietly the way big moments often do, slipping into the calendar without ceremony. And I realized I wasn't counting down with excitement or dread, just awareness, like my body already knew it was time to close this chapter. The room looked smaller as boxes stacked higher, memories tucked into corners I hadn't noticed before, and every object felt heavier, not because of sentiment, but because it represented a version of me that had learned something the hard way. She packed to our movements overlapping, but not colliding, like two people who had learned the choreography of shared space without conversation, and in that silence, I felt an unexpected calm, because unresolved feelings no longer demanded attention. One afternoon, she paused while taping a box and said my name softly, not apologetic, not defensive, just neutral, and asked if I was doing okay. And the simplicity of the question surprised me more than any apology would have. I answered honestly that I was better than before and meant it, and the moment passed without drama, without resolution, without anything needing to be fixed. And that felt right. Later that night, alone in the room, I thought about how much energy I used to spend explaining myself to people who were never really listening, and how powerful it felt to finally stop narrating my boundaries like they needed justification. The truth settled in gently that not everyone who hurts you is a villain, and not every decision that protects you is cruel. An understanding that made me kinder to myself than I had been in months. I took one last look at the space where so much tension had lived and noticed how neutral it felt, now stripped of expectation, and that neutrality felt like freedom. When my parents arrived the next morning, I carried boxes down the stairs without looking back, and for the first time all year, my chest felt light, like I wasn't bracing for anything. The drive away from campus was quiet, and I watched buildings blur past, thinking about how easy it is to lose yourself when you prioritize harmony over honesty, and how hard it is to find yourself again. Once you've gone quiet for too long, I promised myself then that future versions of me wouldn't have to shout through frustration to be heard, because I would listen sooner. Weeks later settled into my new place, routines forming slowly. Peace growing in ordinary moments, like mornings without tension, nights without anxiety, and conversations that didn't require strategic silence. Sometimes I thought about her, wondered if she understood the impact of that year, or if she framed the story differently, and I realized it didn't matter, because my healing didn't depend on her understanding anymore. I learned that closure isn't always mutual. Sometimes it's private, sometimes it's quiet, and sometimes it's just deciding not to carry a question forward. I stopped replaying the events, stopped rewriting conversations in my head, stopped asking myself if I had been too harsh or too passive, and in that stopping, I found rest. The situation no longer defined me, it simply informed me, and that difference changed everything. I didn't become harder because of it, I became clearer. And clarity is a kindness, especially to yourself. That year taught me how to take up space without apology and how to protect what I bring into it. And that lesson stayed with me long after the boxes were unpacked. Have you ever found closure without an apology? Time passed in a way that felt gentle instead of rushed days blending into each other without the sharp edges I had grown used to, and I noticed how my nervous system slowly unlearned the habit of bracing itself for conflict. I began trusting my instincts again, making decisions without running them through imagined arguments or hypothetical reactions, and that quiet confidence felt unfamiliar, but welcome. like wearing a jacket that finally fit. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled across a post about roommate boundaries, written by someone who sounded angry and misunderstood, and for a moment, I felt the old urge to explain, to justify, to prove my side of a story to strangers who didn't know me. Then, I closed the app. That moment felt like a victory. Not because I was avoiding discussion, but because I no longer needed validation from people who weren't part of my life. I realized how often we seek agreement as a substitute for self-trust, and how exhausting that chase can be when you already know the truth of your own experience. Friends noticed the change too, commenting on how calm I seemed, how grounded, and I smiled because the calm wasn't something I found. It was something I stopped disrupting. I had spent so long confusing discomfort with growth and endurance with strength that choosing ease felt almost rebellious. There were nights I replayed everything, not with anger but curiosity, wondering how many times I had ignored my own needs before they turned into resentment. And the answer was uncomfortable but necessary. Growth didn't come from being right. It came from being honest about what I could and could not tolerate. I started setting boundaries in small ways, declining plans without guilt, speaking up sooner, asking for clarity instead of assuming, and each small act reinforced the belief that my comfort mattered. The experience reshaped how I viewed conflict, not as something to win or avoid, but something to navigate with intention. And that shift changed every relationship that followed. I stopped being the easy one, the accommodating one, the one who absorbed inconvenience to keep things smooth, and in doing so, I didn't lose connection, I gained respect. Sometimes I wondered if she ever reflected on that year the way I did, but I no longer needed to know because reflection isn't contagious, it has to be chosen. What surprised me most was how forgiving I felt, not because she earned it, but because holding on to anger had become unnecessary weight. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing behavior, it was about releasing myself from its grip. I learned that peace doesn't always arrive as an apology or an acknowledgement. Sometimes it arrives quietly when you finally stop arguing with your past. Looking back, I didn't regret reporting the situation or standing up for myself. I only regretted how long it took me to believe I was allowed to. That belief changed how I showed up everywhere, and that made the discomfort worth it. I wasn't shaped by conflict alone, but by how I chose to respond to it, and that choice was mine. The story no longer hurt to tell, and that was how I knew I had healed. What boundary changed your life the most? The story followed me in quieter ways after that surfacing, not as pain, but as awareness in moments where I once would have stayed silent and now chose my voice without rehearsing it. First, I noticed it in conversations when someone crossed a line, and I addressed it gently immediately without letting it grow into something sharp later. And each time I did that, a small part of me felt steadier. More rooted, I realized how much of my past exhaustion came from emotional delay, from swallowing discomfort until it fermented, and this time, I refused to store what needed to be released. Life kept moving. New friendships, new routines, new challenges, and yet the lesson remained relevant because boundaries aren't one-time decisions, they are practices that ask for consistency. There were moments I still doubted myself, wondered if I was being too firm, too sensitive, too much, and then I remembered how being too little had cost me more. I stopped apologizing for clarity, stopped softening truths to make them easier to accept, and what amazed me was how many people responded better to honesty than they ever had to silence. I became more selective, not closed, just intentional, and that intention filtered my life in ways I didn't expect. Removing friction I once believed was normal. One afternoon, while unpacking a box, I found an old notebook from that year filled with half-written thoughts, questions I never asked, sentences that trailed off where my courage should have continued. Reading it felt like meeting a younger version of myself who was trying so hard to be reasonable instead of respected, and I felt tenderness, not judgment. I wrote one final sentence on the last page, something simple, something true. I'm allowed to take up space without earning it. Closing the notebook felt symbolic. Like closing a door, I no longer needed to keep cracked open. The memory of that room that year, that tension became just that, a memory, no longer a lens through which I viewed every conflict. I learned that not all consequences are punishments, some are corrections, and the fear I once felt around standing up for myself had softened into trust. Trust that I could handle discomfort, trust that I would survive, disapproval, trust that protecting myself didn't make me unkind. When people asked about that year, I told the story plainly, without embellishment, without defense, and the neutrality of my tone surprised even me. Neutrality didn't mean indifference, it meant resolution. I stopped asking if I was wrong and started asking what felt aligned, and that question guided me more accurately than any outside opinion ever had. The version of me who once lay awake anxious about being labeled dramatic or difficult would hardly recognize the calm certainty I carried. Now, I didn't become fearless, I became willing, and that willingness changed everything. Looking back, I see how that experience wasn't an ending, but a beginning one that taught me how to trust myself in moments where silence once felt safer. And every time I choose my voice now, I honor the version of me who learned that lesson the hard way. Have you ever realized being too little cost you more than being too much? Sometimes I think about how small the moment was when everything changed. Not dramatic, not loud, just a quiet decision to stop betraying myself for the sake of peace, and how strange it is that the smallest choices often reshape us the most. That year no longer feels heavy when I recall it. It feels instructive, like a chapter that existed to teach me how to listen inward before reacting outward. I learned that being kind does not require being invisible, and being understanding does not mean absorbing harm. And those distinctions now guide me more than rules ever could. When I enter shared spaces now, whether rooms, relationships, or conversations, I arrive fully present, aware of my needs without shame, and willing to communicate them without armor. I no longer measure my worth by how little trouble I cause or how easy I make things for others, and letting go of that habit freed more energy than I realized it was consuming. The experience taught me that discomfort is not always a sign to retreat. Sometimes it is an invitation to stand still and speak clearly. I used to believe that asserting myself would make me harder to love, but the opposite proved true because clarity attracts people who respect you and repels those who benefit from your silence. There is peace in that filter. I stopped replaying alternate versions of the past, stopped imagining different outcomes, stopped wondering if I could have handled things better because growth does not require perfection, only awareness. That room, that rule, that broken hairdryer became symbols, not of conflict, but of awakening. And I no longer flinch at the memory because it no longer owns me. I carry the lesson quietly now, woven into how I live, how I choose, how I respond, and that quiet strength feels more powerful than any validation I once chased. Sometimes I share this story not to seek agreement, but to remind others that their comfort matters, even when it inconveniences someone else. Especially then, I see myself now as someone who can hold boundaries without hostility and compassion, without self-erasure. And that balance feels like home. If I could speak to the girl I was then, I would tell her this. You are not dramatic for wanting respect. You are not cruel for protecting your space, and you do not owe silence to anyone who ignores your limits. The fear passes, the clarity stays, and that is how I know the story has ended not with forgiveness or apology, but with self-trust strong enough to stand on its own. Every chapter since has been lighter, not because conflict disappeared, but because I no longer disappear within it. I learned how to choose myself without apology and how to do it with grace. That lesson followed me into every room after that, and I am grateful for it even now. Some stories hurt while they happen and heal while they are remembered. This is one of those stories. Do you believe self-trust is something you learn or something you reclaim?